Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today's November 1, 2024. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Also want to thank Bill Coons for introducing me to today's guest, Jonathan R. Slater. Where in the heck you calling in from, Jonathan?
Well, I'm in the city of Brossard, which is on the south shore of Montreal in Quebec, Canada. It's not in Montreal. It's across the river, across the St. Lawrence River from downtown Montreal, about 15 minutes by train.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
What is the best thing for a human being? Um, well, I don't know if I would resort to the superlative best thing. I think that tends to get us into sort of absolute arguments. I would say good things for human beings or better things. I think autonomy would rate up there. That is, being in control of one's own destiny, being free. Not only being free to choose one's path in life, but being free to communicate, being free to pursue one's goals and one's paths, to be able perhaps not just to survive, although survival is highly underrated, I have to say, but to be able to flourish. I would sort of hang my answer on the hook of ancient Greece, ancient Greek philosophy, Aristotelian thinking. That is to flourish. That is to be able to live a good, purposeful life and to flourish.
That is well done. You're like, don't sell the steak, sell the sizzle. You're a wordsmith. Right off the bat, you're knocking them out of the park with some great words. And I love you challenging the superlative, because that's actually in my book, Strange Questions. It's I'm crashing my brother's teenage daughter's pizza party once to just get a free piece of pizza. And so, I've got like what, eight, 15-year-old women stand around me. I says, "Hey, what's the best thing for a human being?" So I went around the room and one of them said exactly what you said. There's no best
No,
thing,
no.
the superlative doesn't work. So it's me and you versus the wording on the question. So one, right off the bat, I'm for stories, anecdotes, tangents. And two, I'm for rewording. Let me change the word, or let me approach that question differently. I'm all for that. So the next one is, what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Well, that's changed over the course of my lifetime. Favorite also, favorite is one of those relative things. It depends on where you are and who you are. I'll just say that, well, one thing that really has improved in terms of what I consider favorite source of information is other people.
Yeah, other
Um,
people. Yeah.
you know, the pandemic, I was in such grief over the pandemic because we were so removed from one another. And I'm from the Bronx. I'm from New York City, and big urban area. And I live in an urban area, not as big as New York City was in my childhood. But one
Yeah.
of the things that I love about cities and about crowds and being with other people is just the contact, the noise, the richness, the sensory stimulation, and talking with other people. And the older I get, the more I love my interactions with other people. So I always have to say, just chewing the fat, like talking with you, Gerry. It's
Yeah.
like,
Dude, we call it direct experience. No, other people. amazing. But you have books that lined up in back of you, and I bet you one of your favorite forms of information in your long life
Is
has
reading.
been reading. So I'm going to do
Absolutely.
a tangent question. Did you
Yeah.
become a reader because your parents told you to? They did it as an example, or three on your own?
Uh, well, I would have to say that I followed the example of my parents.
Yeah.
Both my parents, my mother and my father, were avid readers. There were books all over the apartment growing up in the Bronx. And one of my mother's favorite stopping places on Fordham Road in the Bronx, near where we lived, was a little bookstore called the Vale Lending Library, Vale. And Mr. Vale owned it. And it was a bookstore, but it also, for like a nickel a day, you could borrow a book.
Wow.
And my mother was borrowing books like they were going out of fashion. My father loved reading. He read until he could read no more. He died at the age of 91, on the cusp of his 92nd birthday, and he was still reading. And so, as a child, of course, my parents read to me. I read. We had, fortunately, growing up where I was growing up, we had two New York City public library branches within walking distance of my apartment building, and I spent a lot of time there. And when I was a kid, before you turn like 12 or 13, the New York City library system, I don't know if it's still the case, during the regular school year, I think the maximum a child could borrow was something like 5 or 6 books. But during like Christmas vacation and summer vacation, you could borrow 13 books. And I always made sure that I borrowed the maximum. And my friends and I would have competitions to see how fast each of us could get through those 13 books, reading, not skimming, reading.
Yeah.
And like, I would come home with these 13 books and I'd devour them. Libraries, there were two things I loved growing up in the Bronx: candy stores and libraries.
Okay, that's a good lead in. I'm going to do another tangent. Your dad lives till
Sure.
91. And
Yeah.
of course, they're called whatever they called, when you have binaries, dualities, false dichotomies.
Yeah.
Some of these early questions are, is it more this or more that? I'm
Right.
not asking you to commit. And I
Sure.
know that it depends. It changes over the years, and it's a little bit of both. But
Yeah.
I'm just your inclination. Your dad living till he's 91. Was it more DNA or more lifestyle choice that
For
got
him,
that helped him live that long? Just your inclination, a little more either way.
well, my dad considered himself the luckiest man in the world. He thought he had lived a great life, but he lived a I would say a life of flourishing. Going back to my earlier theme of flourishing, my dad fought in 5 battle theaters as a Marine in World War II in the Pacific. He lived
Yeah.
through the Great Depression with his family. He fought his way to the top in his employment situation. So he was a tough nut, and but he enjoyed his life tremendously. He felt it terribly fulfilling. So, and he was a heart attack survivor more than once. He was a cancer survivor, and yet he pushed on. So I think grit. If you give me another choice, I think it was a lifestyle. I don't think that I think it's a matter of grit and loving life, and he had
You
both.
mean attitude. You'd say it's more attitude, grit.
Attitude, yeah, for sure,
I like
attitude,
grit. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
why do humans collect or gather information?
Well, first of all, I think that humans collect and gather information um, because it's in our anatomy, it's in our physiology.
Yeah.
That at some point, what's the guesstimate? What, 300,000 years ago, uh, human language came about, was invented. I was having a conversation with a dear cousin of mine yesterday, and I made the remark to her, you know, before human language, nobody complained about anything. Everybody was just,
That's, you know what, Jane Wagner,
yeah,
Lily Tomlin's
yeah,
writing partner said, humans invented language to complain.
yeah. I mean, how do you complain without language?
You're
I mean,
doing
it's,
with the gesture, dude. You're anticipating all our questions,
yeah, no,
all
how,
everything that's upcoming, because you can do it with gesture. You're like, that's cool.
well, yeah, but you know, those are more ambiguous. You know, on a parallel note, my dissertation advisor, one of the great media ecologists of the 20th into 21st century, Christine Nystrom. I'm sure you've heard about her. She was my dissertation advisor in the media ecology program at NYU, and I know I'm paraphrasing her terribly, but she said, you know, before the phonograph, there was no evidence humans could speak.
Wow.
And but I think seriously, getting back, you know, I think humans collect and gather information um, for a number of reasons. Obviously, there's a physiological imperative, um, but you know, there's an evolutionary imperative there. The gathering and communicating of information certainly gives us uh, a competitive advantage, evolutionary in terms of our evolution. Also, one of the effects of that, and this comes up in the writing and conversations in the field, in the sort of the field akin to media ecology, general semantics, um, which has this notion of time binding, and that language uh, gives us this one advantage over the rest of the animal species, and that is we can not just pass down knowledge from generation to generation, but we can accumulate that knowledge, and we can edit it, and we can revise it, and so we can build upon previous generations, and that's something that no other species except ours has been able to do, and that's been largely, if not entirely, due to language. The
Yeah.
question why, you ask
Yeah,
why.
Jonathan, you answered it fine,
Okay,
because you'll see a lot of the themes you can suss out more as the questions
yeah,
come.
sure.
But you suss it out good. You did answer the next question, is it more DNA or more invented, this need or want to collect information? You sort of said, hey, we're kind of hardwired to collect information, or it's in our
Well, we are, and you know, if you go back to the 1970s with Noam Chomsky's um, uh, work on grammar, he his work in grammar was based on a premise that humans were hardwired for language,
Yeah.
um, and uh,
Well, that's
that,
too.
yeah, you can make the argument that it is DNA, but at the same time, we have an ability to think about our thinking. We have an ability
Yeah.
to communicate about our communicating. So, in a way, uh, I don't know if it becomes a chicken or the egg question, but the fact that we are able to language about our language uh, sort of takes it out of the realm of biological imperative, and uh, makes it a much more of a question of intellect.
Yeah. It's metacognition, but you covered a lot. Yeah, I mean, you got ESP major, dude. 2 questions from now is the Chomsky question, but here it is. Here's the next. No, there's 3. 3 more, and we'll get to Chomsky. Fill in the blank, Jonathan. I don't know what I think until I
don't know what I think until I visualize.
Wow. Okay, wait a minute. That's good. Visualize is a key word. Before you elucidate, McLuhan said, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So
Right.
now, if you want to suss out visualize, that's
Yeah.
another.
I wouldn't necessarily characterize myself as a visual person. For example, my mother was an artist, but I have none of that talent. And But yet, when I reflect on my own thinking, I tend to organize my thinking in visual
Yeah.
terms. Um, but at the same time, for example, like if I'm writing something, it's difficult for me just to sit down and write something. I have to visualize is the best term. It's not really visual. I have to put it together. I have to edit. I have to agglomerate in my head before I put something down on paper, and then it sort of blurts out.
You would love all the answers I've gotten in 40 years, 1,000 interviews of what people say. But just last week, a woman said, I don't know what I think until I rant about it for 30 minutes. So, I mean, that's what, people, that whole thing from when, anyways, it's a question coming up. Can humans think without language?
Well, sure.
Good. Okay.
Sure, we can think without language. I mean, present day humans. But again, it comes to that 300,000 year question. What were we doing? Because we were, I'm guessing, and I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I'm guessing we were Homo sapiens sapiens before we language, and that there was a point in our intellectual evolution where we started to language. Obviously, some of that had to do with anatomy
Yeah.
um, uh, but
Well, here's Chomsky.
yeah,
Language is not just words. It's a
right,
culture, it's a tradition, a
right.
unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Well, to sort of take it some distance from Chomsky. There are others in the field of semiotics uh, who, talk about nonverbal signs, nonverbal cues, and we know that we're going back to my dear dissertation advisor, Christine Nystrom. She said, she probably wasn't the first to say it, but I remember her saying it, and it's in her writings: is you cannot not communicate. So if you're um, if you're talking about you can certainly communicate without language, and you can make the argument, for example, that other species of animals that do have certain types of communication systems, if you want to call them languages, fine. They communicate without human language. That's for sure. Um, uh, Even, for example, if you look at some of the work that was done uh, with the great apes and teaching them, for example, sign language, there was sparse evidence that the apes would pass on their vocabulary and their grammar to their offspring without human prompting. I could be wrong about that, but I think that we're able to communicate with all sorts of means without necessarily using language. Now, the problem is with this sort of assumption that you can do that, because everything that we do as human beings in 2024 and even before is done within the context of language. Even those things that we consider non-linguistic may in fact be surrogates for language.
Yeah.
So earlier you said, well, you can gesture and things like that. But when you think about those gestures, all of our gestures in no matter what culture, no matter what language, are actually surrogates for spoken language. That is, you can find a substitute word or phrase or linguistic idea for a, for example, for hand gestures or facial emblems or physical movements. Because our being is so embedded in language, there's very little that we do that, even if we consider it non-linguistic, it's really linguistic, in my opinion.
Okay, that was good, because I'm just asking, you're at the grocery store and the clerk doesn't understand you. What do you do when there's a language breakdown? What simply do you do? Is there any kind of formula thought you would do to communicate? So just, with a friend or a clerk at a store, you have language breakdown, what would you do?
Well, there's so many. It depends on what you mean by a breakdown. If that breakdown is caused by a break in linguistic understanding because you don't speak the same language, then you can do what people have been doing for centuries, and that is gesture. And you can always talk louder, which never works. I love that in New York City when the tourists don't speak English. You see the folks try to talk and they talk louder as if that's going to make a difference, right? No,
I love that one. Talk louder. Believe
Uh,
me, I go to a James Joyce reading club with New Yorkers, and it is way different than all the other Joyce reading clubs. Okay, but
yeah.
there's
But
one
anyhow,
other
you
thing.
can write things.
Yeah.
There
Well,
are a
let's
number
go
of.
with the talk louder. That's you really scored. You hit it out of the park with talk louder, dude. I know there's many, but here's the thing you said, which you said she taught you. You cannot not communicate.
That's right.
That's a double negative. So, Alfred E. Newman, my hero from Mad Magazine,
Oh.
said the English language is the only language where a double negative is a no-no.
Well, I'll tell you about double negatives. There's a one of my colleagues at SUNY Plattsburgh, where I taught for almost 25 years, fellow in computer science, had this really good anecdote. He said he sort of posed the question. I'm trying to frame it right. He said there's no instance where an affirmative expression said twice can be conceived as a negative, and you go, yeah.
That's very similar to the Mad Magazine.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I was a big reader of Mad Magazine when I was a kid, and I loved Alfred E. Newman. Yeah, and I still refer to him from time to time. I don't know if my students know who.
Okay, Jonathan, your observations of humans in general. Are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Sometimes. No, that's a trick question and a trick answer, Gerry. But
we invented. You can't
right.
separate feeling from thought. But we
Well,
invented the words thinking and we invented the words feeling, so we think we can. But okay, what do you guess? 80% of people say we're more feeling beings, and here's how they say it.
Yeah.
I think we're more feeling beings. That's how they answer that.
Yeah. Well, there's this I guess this rule or piece of advice in watching and surveilling your own language, like you just made an allusion to, is that oftentimes when we say I feel or I believe, you're really saying I think.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a tendency for us to be feeling beings, that I think that the affective component of our, if I can be sort of contradictory here, the affective component of our thinking looms very large. I mean, Sigmund Freud was quite aware of this, and you know, when I've had this conversation with my students, I ask them, you know, why are you in school? Why are you in college? And I'll get to the point where I'll say, you know, a lot of you probably are of the mind that you're doing this for a degree, for a career. And I said, well, in my opinion, and in the opinion of my colleagues, you're in school to learn how to think. And the reason that you learn how to think is so that you rely less on your emotions to make your decisions. And I had said earlier in our conversation, Gerry, that survival is highly underrated. And I think survival is highly underrated. And that's probably because in our material culture, everybody wants to be rich and famous, perhaps. But one of the things I've told my students over the years is that the reason that you need to learn to think and to reason is so that you can survive, because there will be times in your life which will be tough, that will be difficult, that will require very cool, rational thinking. And that generally is not the time to rely on your emotions to make critical decisions. And if you can think, and not only is thinking important, but being able to analyze and to engage in metacognitive processes, to think about your thinking, to challenge your own thinking. Yeah. Very important. And I believe that earnestly, Gerry.
Yeah, you're really articulate and you're smart, because like I said, 80-90% of them, well, we're more feeling beings. And, you know, Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. And I'm like, good luck. How are you going to turn your brain off? That's like people who meditate, they go, now think about not thinking. There's a bumper sticker on my street on a car. It says, don't believe everything you think. And I says, well, you could say, don't believe everything you feel. Right. So again, it's you well articulated why that answer could be a little more, we're more thinking beings, but we want to think we're more feeling beings or whatever. Right. But the word thinking, I have to tell you, my 3 key lines I love to repeat is, the Marx Brothers are in a jam and one of them says, we've got to think. And the other one said, we already tried that.
I love the Marx Brothers. Alfred E. Newman, we're on the same page here, Gerry.
Yeah, and then Captain Beefheart said, I've had too much to think. And in this one's relevant for this very week we're about to be in. George Clinton said, think it ain't illegal yet.
Oh, yeah. Well, George Orwell in 1984 made it a crime.
Yeah.
The thought crime.
Police. Yeah.
The thought crime. And there are probably places, there are certainly places in the world where thinking can get you into a lot of trouble. I just wanted to add a footnote to this thing about, I don't want to be dismissive of feeling. And I think I just want to go on the record here. For a number of years, I was the director of the Institute for Ethics and Public Life at the State University of New York in Plattsburgh, where I had my teaching career. And this was often in conversation at the Institute. This was often I wouldn't say an issue, but it was a question that came up. And one, we tend to think, for example, of ethics as a purely intellectual pursuit, that when we think about ethics, we think about thinking. But in recent years, there have been some philosophers, there have been some ethicists who have underscored the importance of understanding the role of feelings in our ethical behavior. And that's just the footnote I want to put there, because I think
Yeah.
that while thinking is, I think, crucial for survival, I also believe that understanding the role of the affective mind, the feelings, is important for how we relate to each other, and how we cope individually, and it's crucial to things like compassion, sympathy, empathy. So we cannot be dismissive of feeling, and feeling, I think, in a very large way, parallel, not to the detriment of our intellect, makes us who we are, makes us human in many
Yeah.
instances.
Well, again, you have ESP. You anticipated the next question beautifully, Jonathan. Two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Well, I don't know what you mean by soul. Soul is a metaphysical term, and soul is interpreted differently by different faiths and different cultures. Um, uh, the um, the term soul, I think, misleads us. I think that it's in a way, it's a red herring. I think that thinking is part of our humanity, and humanity, is, if you're going to start to divide the human being into things like soul and flesh, and I think that that could be, in a way, that could be risky, because we are whole people. Um, uh, if you believe that a soul drives you, fine. But let's pretend that we don't have souls. Let's pretend that there's no God. Let's pretend that there's no, I sound like John Lennon. Let's pretend that there's no heaven. I mean, um, uh, does that excuse us from behaving morally? Does that
Yeah.
excuse us from acting ethically? No, of course not. So I think this notion of soul is a red herring. I don't know what soul means. It's used differently. As I said, it's used differently by different people in different occasions. I don't think anyone, if you went out and did a person on the street interview and you asked people to define the soul, you wouldn't get any consensus on the answer. And it would be, in many instances, it would be very mystical and magical, and in a way, counterproductive.
Let me interject before I go to the second Turing question, Jonathan. This is Harold Bloom when they ask him, do you believe in God? And he says, my attitude towards Yahweh is that I don't like him and I don't trust him and I wish he'd go away, but I know he won't because he's built into the language. As Nietzsche said, he's part of the way we think. As soon as you use a verb involving being, you're in trouble.
Yeah,
So it's sort
yeah,
of like what you said. But again, Lily Tomlin says reality is just a collective hunch.
yeah,
We kind of have a collective hunch what we think that
yeah,
what a soul is, but
yeah,
you really sussed it out. And again, I'm not after you answering the questions. I'm just asking these as prompts for
yeah.
you to
Sure.
talk.
Oh,
And
I understand that.
you're really teaching me a lot, and I appreciate it. You're a real smart guy, especially wordsmith. Okay, the second Turing question is, can machines think?
Well, again, we have to parse that out, don't we? Uh, um, I mean, there are all sorts of machines, first of all. Do you mean, I mean, if it's Turing, we're talking about computers. And any computational part of a machine. And thinking, I mean, we don't really even have a definition of what thinking is. I mean, if we go, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. And I mean, I studied science and biology in high school and in college, and I'm fairly fluent reader of science articles, but if you say thinking is merely the electrochemical processes going on in our neurons and synapses in our brain, can we imitate that? Can we imitate that electrochemical activity in a machine? I'd say sure, you can imitate it. You can mimic that to a large extent. We're doing that sort of. I think machines can emulate certain types of thought processes.
Yeah.
And again, you have to remember the machines are largely doing so at our behest. We're the ones thinking about the machines thinking. And certainly machines, certain computers have heuristic processes. And for example, artificial intelligence is a very good example of an accelerated heuristic process taken to the extreme. So, and I sound like I'm hedging because I'm hedging. It's like, I can't remember who wrote that science fiction story. It was a short story about a computer. This is a 1950s, 1960s sort of apocalyptic type of story where these scientists start feeding this computer all sorts of data information, very much like we're feeding we're feeding programs, computer programs. We're feeding them all of this data for the purposes of building these great whole language models, AI, and stuff like that. But they start these, and I'm trying to remember who wrote this story. Maybe it was Sibiak. I'm not sure who the author was, but he says, and they keep feeding it, and they keep on asking it this question: is there a God? And at a certain level of data, the computer answers, now there is.
You mean because they asked the question, you created it?
Well, yeah, the question obviously got the computer curious about it, but also the fact is that there was a certain level of data input where it became practical for the computer to answer, yeah, okay, sure, that's me. So I'm going to continue to hedge on this question. I think that we can create the fiction in our minds, just to shift things. We can create the fiction in our minds that machines can think.
Yeah.
I think that we can engage in a type of wishful thinking that machines can think. Yeah. I think we can misidentify the types of processes that machines exhibit as a type of thinking. But can they do what we do? Well, I'll say no, ellipse, not yet.
Yeah. Well, that's funny because Phil Lesh just died of Grateful Dead. His favorite book was More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon. Frank Zappa's favorite book was also More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon. So it is.
Sturgeon was a great science fiction writer too.
Yeah, yeah, and that's sci-fi. That's what McLuhan said.
Right.
To his mom, his first book, ads are advertising your field is our characters. And there's science fiction. I wrote a science fiction novel, and the ads are characters. That's what Marshall said to his mom about
Right.
Mechanical Pride. But
Right.
again, we learned from McLuhan, by flipping AI, you flip it into IA,
Right.
integral awareness. So
Right.
do thoughts create emotions?
In certain instances, I would say so. And probably the reverse is true, that
Yeah.
emotions create thoughts. Uh, you know, even though he was in toward the middle of the 20th century, probably a little bit before, Freud may have been discredited on certain levels. I think that nonetheless, there are a number of very valid ideas that Freud brought forward, and that I would sitting here trying to answer that question, I'm trying to think about what Freud said about emotions and intellect and vice versa. Of course, Freud had divided the mind into the id and the ego, and and when I talk about Freud, especially in my advertising and public relations classes, because in order to understand anything about advertising, you have to understand the psychology of advertising. In order to understand the psychology of advertising, you have to understand something about Freud. But I said, think about your dreams. You wouldn't want your dreams to invade your conscious life. I said, because that would be the equivalent of a psychotic break, and a lot of your affective life is repressed. It's hidden away in your unconscious. And Freud knew, he saw it firsthand in his diagnosing his neurotic patients, that when the unbridled affective mind starts to sort of bleed into your more reasoned, rational, intellectual life, that could be the cause of trouble. But also the suppression, the repression of the affect of emotions also can lead to trouble. So I think that there's an interplay between the two. I think, yes, thought and emotion intermingle all the time, and sometimes it's very hard to distinguish between the two.
Same question, in other words, Jonathan. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Well, this notion of happiness is an invention of post-industrial revolutionary capitalist society, materialist society, because there are many cultures on this world where if you were to pose the question, are you happy? You'd be, people would look at you as if you had just sort of landed from Mars. Happiness is not a thing. We like to reify it. We like to give it substance and solidity, but it's not a thing. And, happiness is such a compelling notion that even, for example, if you look at translations of Aristotle, some translations take his notion of, and I'm going to slaughter the Greek eudaimonia, this notion of flourishing. It's even been translated as happiness, when it's in my mind, I don't think that Aristotle and his compatriots in ancient Greece had the slightest notion of what we call happiness today. And I think that causes a lot of trouble. I think if you pursue this reified notion of happiness and you don't find it, then you have a potential of becoming frustrated and disgruntled. And we see it in the political life of the United States and elsewhere in the Western world, in the Western capitalist, materialist cultures, that because people feel that they are unable to achieve happiness, it makes them sad and mad, and it fills them with grievance. I think that the search for meaning certainly might be more conducive to a good life. I think that we've left behind some of these really fundamental, I'm going to say, go back to Aristotelian notions, but we see them in other, among other philosophers, other great minds of history. This pursuit of flourishing has been sort of cast aside. That if your notion of living a good life is materiality, is having material possession, it's always going to be, in most cases, elusive. I think that we can certainly aim to for better things other than happiness. I think that not too many people are talking about what does it mean, if that's what you mean by meaning, what does it mean to live a good life?
Yeah, that's the question. I got it from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He says happiness doesn't necessarily last, meaning tends to last. So, Jonathan, does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away? Are we more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Well, it depends what you mean by consciousness. If you mean by consciousness you mean something akin to self-awareness or awareness of one's own being. Well, let's see if I can answer the question this way. I think to a certain extent we detect consciousness. I think that and again, there's this dichotomy that we have to, that are we talking about the brain or we're talking about the mind? If we're talking about the brain, then we're talking about these electrochemical processes most of all, and are those processes generating a level of detection? Is there a consciousness detector going off in your brain? Well, maybe. I don't know enough about human anatomy and physiology to say the contrary, but I'll say maybe. I'll concede that much.
Yeah, that's what I'm after, is your hunch or your guess.
Right now,
what medical scientist, and I'm just going for your hunch or your guess. But I just let me interject, because you are a good listener. You notice how I word it. I goes, does the brain more detect or create consciousness? And then I give the example of bubbling, and then I go, are we more? So, that shifts it from the brain. You entered the word mind, and then we as a complete human. Are we as a complete human detecting or creating it? So that was good listening. So yeah,
well, so if we shift it over to the mind, because the mind is a gestalt. It's much more than the brain. We do have 5 senses that act as a result of neurological activity.
Yeah.
But we also have sensory activity that goes beyond, I would say, mere physiological function. And we spend our lives, don't we really spend our lives? I sort of pose it as maybe rhetorical. Don't we spend our lives trying to figure out what that perception is all about? And maybe that's the better term, is perception rather than sensing. And of course, McLuhan was very much interested in this whole notion of perception. So um, the question: do we invent
consciousness or detect?
consciousness?
Yeah.
So on a neurological level, we may be able to detect it. On a perceptual level, we certainly may be able to detect it. But also, I would say, because we are an inventive species, largely because of our linguistic abilities, because of language, we may in fact ascribe a lot of what we perceive as consciousness, because that's the way we, I know I'm getting into a sort of a tautology here, but it's a way that we talk about it. If we talk about consciousness in certain ways, then we tend to feel the consciousness in certain ways. And again, we've come up with all sorts of strategies to talk about and think about consciousness. And you talked earlier about this idea of the soul. If the soul is consciousness, sure. If consciousness is soul, sure. But again, it's an idea. It's something that we reify. It's something we believe exists because we tend to say it exists. There are obviously experiments that we can start, that we can use to measure various activities of the brain, certain mindful functions, certain intellectual capacities and processes. But is the sum total of that the equivalent of consciousness? Just because we can measure something doesn't mean that in fact it exists. That's the question.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought? I'm glad you're laughing, because that's the whole purpose of this series, is to have fun.
Well, if you ask me about my thinking, light is a lot faster than my speed of thought. I would tend to thought is a not only a sensory process, but it's a censored process, right? Even those people who say things that they shouldn't, whose mouth metaphorically moves faster than their brain, nonetheless are engaging in some form of there's a censorship, there's an editing that goes on in thinking. Is there such a thing as pure thinking, unadulterated thinking, that probably would be faster than the speed of light? McLuhan talked about light being a pure form of information. I don't think the light bulb. Well, yeah, the light bulb, turning on the light bulb, and I don't think thinking beats out the light bulb or light. I think that thinking gets worked over in the brain, worked over in the mind, before we can even develop an utterance. It's just that we don't necessarily, we're not necessarily aware of that. And also there's a type of rationalization that goes on about our own thinking. And I think that we have, we tend to have some idealistic notions about our thinking. I think our thinking is very, again, I can only be speaking about myself, but I think thinking is muddy. It's a muddy process. I don't think it's a pure, I mean, maybe there are some folks, some great geniuses, whose thinking exceeded the speed of light. I was listening on here in Canada. We have a CBC music program called Tempo, and it's a morning music program. And there was an anecdote about the host likes to tell anecdotes about the both the composers and the musicians. And there was this anecdote about Mozart, and I love Mozart and love Mozart's music, and I love learning things about him. And so when he was a little boy, his family, his parents, took him out to a farm, and they go into the barn, and the pig squeals, and little Mozart, this could be all apocryphal, who knows, but it sounds likely. And Mozart shouts out, G flat, or G sharp, no, G sharp, excuse me, A flat, G sharp. And one of the people in the family runs into the house where there's a piano, taps on G sharp, says, the kid got it right. So a guy like Mozart, he had light speed thinking. I'm sure of it. I'm sure of it, unparalleled. But I would say, the rest of us, our thinking tends to be muddy. And
I think, Jonathan, you answered it, because you say, well, since we create these things with language, then we're the co-creator. The thing doesn't exist on its own. And I think that's sort of what, when people go, what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought? And they go, speed of thought. I goes, there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but that one you got right, because we invented the word speed of light. But I know what you're saying, and I appreciate how you rationale that. Right. But I wanted to just interject this, bringing up McLuhan. He was being playful. You use the word work, and that's fun. And you brought up Mozart. What did he do? He played music. So there's this amazing thing with music. It's relies more on play than it does on work, but they got to work at it. And Frank Zappa said two things that you touched on too. He says, you don't want to see, in the middle of one of his songs, he goes, you don't want to see what's behind my eyes. Well, we all have these thoughts in our head. Maybe it's good we're getting them out, but we don't necessarily even want to voice them or recognize them, because they're just our brain going on. And so that caused Frank to write a song that goes, who are the brain police? Instead of telling you, oh, the brain police are this evil capitalist corporate society, or the brain police is the voice inside your head, he just posed it as a question. Who are the brain police? So then it was up to you to suss it out and have fun with it and be playful, rather than taking things so serious, because that's what Marshall did. He says, well, actually, Donald Thiel said it best, I think. He said, Marshall teased people to believe his percepts were concepts. So he's in academia. You're supposed to have concepts, con jobs. You're supposed to have theories. He wasn't. He was just saying, I'm going to say these as percepts, perceptual,
Right. And oh, by the way, Zappa also said, don't you go where the Huskies go, don't you eat that yellow snow. McLuhan said, I don't explain, I explore.
That was actually him quoting Mallarmé.
Right. But I might say this and get into some trouble with colleagues on this, but he actively avoided the label of theorist. He said, I don't have any theories, but really, if you look at his entire opus, he did have theories.
I know, but that's him being. That's why he's called.
That's him being playful, right?
And that's him being playful, and that's him being a charlatan, because he knows he says things and he's like me. He's a hypocrite. I'm a hypocrite. He wasn't so much a hypocrite, but it's like, he wants to embrace contradiction.
Yeah, well, he wants to embrace contradiction because on one level he wants you to think about what he's saying. He wants to slow down your thought process,
Good. Good. I
because
like that.
and he writes. McLuhan was considerably criticized, especially by those people who didn't read his books.
Yeah.
For his sort of obtuse style of writing, but it
Yeah.
really wasn't obtuse. What McLuhan was doing, and this is my perception,
Yeah.
was he wanted you to slow down,
Yeah. It's really good.
and understand what he was getting at. And the comment was made, and I don't remember who made this comment, is that when McLuhan wrote, each sentence was the equivalent of a paragraph or a chapter.
Yeah.
And when you read McLuhan, that's why you can read McLuhan out of sequence if you
Yeah.
desire to do that. But McLuhan was very clever about understanding thinking and understanding language. That was his bailiwick, was language.
Yeah.
And
It's
when
because
you read,
he learned everything he knew from Finnegan's Wake and the Symbolists. He said it. He said, in order to understand me, you have to know all of Joyce and all of the Symbolists. And look at Jonathan, it's exactly your line of work. Advertising. Edgar Allan Poe invented effects precede causes. That's reasoning backwards. That is the detective novel. I'm only going to give you so much information. He spawned the Symbolist, which spawned the rock poets, Dylan, Kurt Cobain, Jim Morrison, Patti Smith. It doesn't matter what words you use, it's the effect you want. So
right.
Mallarmé said, you don't have to paint the painting, you paint the effect you want it to have. So that's what advertising is I'm just painting an effect. I'm not painting an ad to buy a Prius. I'm painting this lifestyle that you can go, oh, that's who I am.
Well, yes, and it goes even deeper than that, because I happen to be, even though I'm retired, I do teach one course a semester at SUNY Plattsburgh, and the course I'm teaching this semester is advertising in the electronic age, and we do focus on a lot of these ideas, and I do discuss with students this notion of effect. That is the effect precedes the cause, very much so with advertising. That is, you have to develop a big idea, and what do you want people? What do you want people to think as a result of your campaign, and how do you want them to behave? And that's why, for example, in an advertising campaign, research is your greatest friend, the ability to understand who your audience is, because without necessarily calling it such, advertising is a rhetorical form, and knowing not only to whom you are communicating, but also what the effect you want from that communication precedes your entire creative process. That is, you haven't even yet begun to build the advertising campaign, but you've already done your research on the audience, and you've already started conceiving of what effect you want. What do you want to happen in the marketplace in order for this ad campaign to work? And I think a lot of ad people don't even understand that process.
Sell the sizzle, not the steak.
Right.
So here's Audre Lorde, the poet.
Yes.
You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools.
True.
Yvonne Rainer, her colleague, said you can if you expose the tools.
Okay.
What new tool do you suggest?
That's your question to me. What new tool to
Yeah, now I'll just put it in context. And just because I open these questions with cute quotes, you don't have to apply the quote. You can if you want.
No.
The word new, you don't have to. It's really what tool do you most gravitate towards. But if you want to apply the quotes in the word new, that's fine. You put all these questions in the context you want.
Well, we know from McLuhan and others that there's really no such thing as a new technology, a new tool.
Yeah.
Tools and technologies have embedded within them earlier tools and technologies,
Yeah.
earlier forms. So I think if we were looking for a new tool, we should look for an old tool and think about ways of using it differently. Although, you know, McLuhan was very keen on, as you brought up with this concept of exposure, was very keen on exposing the environments, the communication and technological environments that we found ourselves, and he was keen on doing this because he wished to talk about this notion of counter environments.
Yeah.
In other words, what are the tools that we use to strip away the environment or the facade of the environment? It's very similar to what Christine Nystrom had said that I quoted. You cannot not communicate when you're immersed, and this is where McLuhan uses the fishbowl metaphor.
Yeah.
of the goldfish. He says, you know, we don't know who invented water, but it certainly wasn't a fish. And you know, when I talk to students of communication and I visually show a goldfish and a goldfish bowl on a slide, is that you know, we are so immersed in our tools and technologies. We're swimming in this high-tech world of communication, and we're not aware of it. It's only when we can start to meta-communicate, it's only when we can actually start to talk about it critically. And not everybody does talk about it critically. It happens to be people like you and me. It happens to be media ecologists who are talking about these things critically. But the vast majority of people swim in that sea, swim in that fishbowl of technology and communication environment without even thinking one critical thought about it. They may complain about it, which might be a good start, but that complaint doesn't necessarily transform into sort of an act of dissidence, an act of resistance, and that's what McLuhan was contemplating in his work. How do we resist this? How do we act in dissent of this environment?
Yeah.
In his earlier works, in you know, when he was writing about like an understanding media, and in other works he's talking about television. This is what he was urging on the early users of television. Keep in mind that television, you know, McLuhan starts his first book was 1952, which is the same year that television becomes commercialized. So by the time that McLuhan's writing about television in 1964 in Understanding Media, television's only been around for 12 years. By 1960 in the United States, 99% of all households had at least one television. That is a stunning figure when you think about it. And that's what McLuhan was concerned about. That's what he was trying to draw our attention to, was this very immersive environment, which was not a not something in parallel to our existence. It had become our existence.
Yeah, I was raised to video, man. That was well put, because I'll tell you something really funny. We're on Zoom. It's called television telephone. We're live across the world. No clunky cameras in New York City. This is television telephone. That's what it is. Guess when it first appeared? 1939 at the New York World's Fair, the same year Finnegan's Wake came out. The whole hidden ground of Finnegan's Wake is television, electricity, how these things shape our behavior. When did it become a reality for us? Was Zoom was 68 when 2001 Space
Yeah,
Odyssey came
yeah,
out.
with Roy
And
Scheider on the
he calls
video call with his daughter from the
with
space
his
station to Earth.
daughter. So then
Yes.
it becomes real. So that's amazing. You brought up this immersive, and you really answered it well, because I would say what the tools you suggest are critical thinking and counter environments. So now the follow-up question is, what new toy do you suggest?
The sledgehammer. It's always worked in the past.
That was fast, Jonathan. I like that. Okay, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Oh, I don't worry about much when I go to bed at night. I live a fairly active life, so when I close my eyes, I'm out. But it's during the daytime that I worry, because I don't want anything disturbing my sleep, and I worry about a lot of things. Interestingly enough, maybe when I was younger, I used to worry about personal things a lot, but
Yeah.
I worry more these days about, the state of the world. And maybe I'm sounding sort of cliche here, but I worry. And I worry about I have a family now, so I worry about my family.
Yeah.
And and I'm not necessarily worried about material things. I'm worried about, survival things, and I tend to worry about the, because I'm a teacher, I worry about the state of education, and I frequently think about the links between, for example, education and democracy. It does preoccupy me. The fact that, for example, you have fewer young people pursuing higher education, which worries me. It disturbs me, and I think about those, just those survival skills. If you have a whole lot of young people who haven't necessarily learned to trust their intellect over their emotions, I'm thinking of their own personal and our collective survival. I think about demagogues. I won't name any right now, but I think of demagogues who appeal to people's emotional state rather than to their moral, ethical, intellectual reasoning, and exhorting them, that our leaders should be exhorting us to live a good life in the Aristotelian sense, and to flourish, and to work toward the flourishing of others, our children, our neighbors, people who are vulnerable, the old people in society, the people who cannot necessarily fend for themselves effectively. That's what I worry about, Gerry. I worry about all of the awfulness on this planet, and I imagine a world where we can do better, where we can help others. We can't necessarily save the entire world, but but you know, uh, we can start by, you know, one person.
I agree.
But if we're just you know, thinking about material things, and if we're thinking about um, uh, you know, what damage we can do to another human being, I think we have a long way to go. We have a long road to hoe.
I agree with you, and I think we can do what most people want is how do we make the world a better place, and how do we, promote kindness, compassion to each other. So McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race.
Yeah,
They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions.
yeah.
So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Jonathan, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
To a certain extent, I think that the ignorance, well, the ignorance exists on several levels. Uh, and again, it depends on what you mean by ignorance. Ignorance could be willful. Um, could be willful. That is, it could be an absence of attention, a willful absence of attention, or it could be simply not knowing, regardless of one's intent. McLuhan was saying to us, awake from your slumber, that his intuition was that the good part of the ignorance was willful, or at least induced by our own thinking. Willful is the wrong term here, because willful speaks to a certain high level of intent, but it could just be that certain behaviors have been induced, and that we've gone along with our we've entertained our behaviors, we've indulged them,
Yeah.
and that McLuhan was, in a way, he was calling out to the wilderness, and see, McLuhan was criticized, and others also. For example, I remember, because I studied under Neil Postman at New York University, and I remember the criticism that would be leveled at Neil Postman, who wrote considerably at times in the vein of Marshall McLuhan, and did it in a way to sort of, I don't want to say popularize, but to provide interpretations and interpolations of McLuhan's work. And McLuhan was criticized on this level too. And folks who read McLuhan or who listened to him, same goes for Postman. They would sort of say, well, you're being very critical of our society. You're being very critical of our communication environment, but you don't offer any solutions. What are you going to do about it? And I remember as a young, university student, doctoral student, listening to that and thinking to myself, as I still think today, I said, well, you're missing the point.
Yeah.
Not everything is a goddamn self-help book. And that, McLuhan was, he was this clarion call, and so was Postman. And, these two great minds were asking us to think.
Yeah.
And to think about our own thinking, to hover, to transcend the environment, to act as counter environments to our own environment, to understand, what's going on. And in a way, I'll go back to my earlier reference to general semantics, the area of general semantics, where one of the big questions that we continually ask in general semantics is, what is going on? What is happening?
Yeah.
Stop, take a step back, examine your own thinking, examine what's going on in the world around you, try and attach some significance to it, and I think that relates again to my interest and my belief that survival is underrated.
Yeah.
Part of survival, part of being able to do more than just get by, but eventually to flourish, is one's ability to examine one's own thinking, one's ability to examine the environment in which we are living, rather than just merely accept it for what it is.
It's a good word, Jonathan. Flourish, and survival is underrated. It's like your aphorisms are really bubbling up. And one thing you evoked was the joke. The guy goes into the bookstore and he says, "Could you show me where the self-help books are?" And the clerk goes, "Wouldn't that defeat the whole purpose?" And then
yeah,
one of my other heroes, Marcel Duchamp, said, "I'm going to contradict myself so I don't conform to my own ideas."
right,
And
right.
so,
Well, that's like Groucho Marx saying, "I wouldn't join any club that would have me as a member."
exactly. Yeah. Who are you going to believe? My eyes or your own? Okay.
Right.
So I asked for 90 minutes. We got about 10 more minutes. And
Sure.
then I would love to do a part 2, or maybe like an 8-part Netflix series, because we only got through, well, we basically got through 9 questions, and usually I do about 40, but this is what
okay.
I want to go deeper and do that counter environment. I don't want people to just go, here's the answer to the question. I want people to suss it out. So you've really done a great job, and I appreciate it. It's been very fun. The next question is, and we can go a little longer if you can, is, do artists have moral obligation?
Well, a question I would ask is, who doesn't have a moral obligation?
Yeah. But it's like this, Jonathan. I know that most people say, because you study ethics and morals, and tell me the difference between the two words, blah, blah, blah. But when Louis Buñuel makes a film like Los Olvidados about the street kids in Mexico, and they beat up a blind guy, these street thugs beat up a blind guy, that's like, well, or even Kubrick making Clockwork Orange, there is some imitation behavior that happens from cinema. Not causing it, but we're just showing you how the world operates, and you decide whether you want this world or not. But there are artists that do stuff that is really exactly what Marshall says, that's counter environmental. It's counter to what moral. So it's sort of like, I agree with you. Yeah, well, everybody has moral obligations, and that's how most people answer it. But a lot of people tend to go, well, no, they don't really have a moral obligation. They have an obligation to themselves, but do they have a moral obligation? So, I mean, maybe you can suss it out deeper, where I'm going, because there is art that fucks your shit up. Like, my favorite thing is art that fucks your shit up and makes you go, I could do that.
Well, McLuhan said art is what you can get away with.
Anything you can get away with.
That's right. Anything you get away with. Now, here's a question. It's not necessarily a question for you, but it's sort of a question
Yeah.
that for my own thinking is something that you believe. Let's hypothetically, let's say you're an artist, you're a filmmaker,
Yeah.
you're a painter, you're a writer,
Yeah.
you're a television producer, whatever.
Yeah.
Is what you construe to be a moral statement, in fact, um, a moral directive or a call for a moral imperative, or is it is it the equivalent of a moral stance?
Yeah.
Perhaps that's a bit of a cynical question, but I think it's worth asking.
Yeah.
Um, so, I think that it comes back to the notion of effect preceding cause.
Yeah.
The notion of formal cause. The so when let's just keep with your filmmaker, Kubrick, whoever. So when a great filmmaker sets out to make a film, obviously there is, I shouldn't say obviously, purportedly there's an effect that the filmmaker wants to produce in the audience. That is, the filmmaker has some idea of what the audience. Now today, of course, filmmakers know exactly, especially if they're making a blockbuster, they know exactly who their audiences are, because films have become commodities that are fleshed out using market research. As a matter of fact, most of the studios use focus groups in order to determine which ending to a film is going to be more popular with film-going audiences. But let's
Yeah, Jonathan, let me interrupt, because it's not. I've studied focus group cinema, and it was started by Harold Lloyd in 1928. But Harry Shearer, the comic,
right.
who plays bass in Spinal Tap, told us they were doing a test screening of Spinal Tap, and someone wrote on the card, "Good film, but you should have got a better rock band." So you see, we don't want our art homogenized. What
No.
you're talking about agenda art. And Zapp even said that. The old days, the kid would come in with his demo, and the record executive's chomping on his cigar, and he says, "I don't know, give it to Joey in the mailroom and ask him if it's any good." Now they take it to the accounting department and go, what you said. They go, "Well, the demographics say it will sell better if it sounds like
Right.
this."
Right. And that's because the market culture is such that market forces
Yeah.
tend to uh, dominate
Yeah.
almost every aspect. This is a point that Cornell West actually made a number of years ago in one of his essays about the perniciousness of a market force society, and that you can say, oh well, uh, give the people what they want,
Yeah.
uh, and that's presuming that you know what they
That's
want.
called create the disease and offer the cure. But there are
Well,
people who break through that, Jonathan, like
yes,
Cornell West. I love him because he quotes Sly Stone in James Brown. James Brown said, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," with a bunch of kids singing it. That was breaking through, and Sly Stone was saying things that was breaking through agenda art. But at the
yeah,
same time, they know if they hit these lines and do these notes, they'll sell their music.
yeah.
So, that's
There,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of sometimes unexpected, surprising um, artistic outlets
Yeah,
that unless you are in that niche or following that niche, you don't necessarily know about. and um, that these outlets are not necessarily something that follow the mainstream conceptualizations of art, which tend to be more and more commodified. I'll give you an example. I had a colleague at SUNY Plattsburgh. Her name was Professor Isabel Arredondo. Sadly, she died suddenly a few years ago. And she was one of the fellows in the Ethics Institute that I led for a number of years. And the project that she was working on, her research, had to do with Super 8 films, and how these filmmakers, for lack of a better term, but they really weren't filmmakers per se. They were using Super 8 as their medium. These were very short films, obviously, because the Super 8 reel is a short reel. And they were filming things of everyday life, could be the slums of Brazil. It could be, famine in North Africa, but they were filming stuff in their environment, and they were bringing to light things that would never make it into mainstream cinema, and possibly not even onto like PBS Frontline, for all of the good that program seems to do. So you do have these unexpected, surprising, and not necessarily influential, but highly intriguing artistic outlets. But we're blinded to them in many ways because the environment has become so flooded with the sort of gross commodification. Not just in terms of film, but one of the things we were talking about, self-help books earlier, right? When I walk into a bookstore, and there aren't really too many bookstores left. I'm talking about independent, standalone bookstores. You go into a chain bookstore, and so much of the categories has really changed. You go into the psychology category in a chain bookstore, and it's not psychology; it's self-help. If you want to find books written by the classic psychologists, you're going to either have to go to the library or go online and search for the book yourself. So our idea of what constitutes acceptable art has changed. And so to go back to your question, I know we've sort of strayed a bit, but is there a moral? Do artists have a moral obligation? Do they? Well, first of all, in order to have a moral obligation, you need a moral conscience, right? You have to feel that you have a moral obligation. But if your obligation is merely to bring more attention to your product, your artistic product, you the last thing on your mind might be your moral obligation, whereas the person making the Super 8 films to a very limited audience might have a greater sense of moral obligation. McLuhan talked about advertising as really sort of this penultimate art form of the 20th century, and I'm sure that most people in the advertising business don't see any moral obligation in what they produce in terms of advertising. I mean, there's some very good moral lessons in some advertising, but I would tend to think that.
Oh, it's funny because Jonathan, there's two ironies which you just brought up. Who's the guy who he practically invented McLuhan as a brand?
Oh, Gossage, Gossage.
Now, Howard Gossage, man, he helped save. He wanted to save environmental issues. So there's the funny. There are guys that have some conscience. He's a
no, I'm not saying they don't have conscience.
But and then all the great artists Warhol, the guy who wrote Wizard of Oz, the guy who invented film noir, Art Nouveau, Zappa. They all worked as ad men first. You worked as an ad man first, then you got the light, and now you preach. Now you preach the evils of advertising. It's
Well,
not evil; it's just another tool. But it's also like R. Crumb, the underground comic,
yeah,
who's a sick puppy in a lot of ways and is an amazing artist in a lot of ways. That movie called Crumb is
yeah,
an amazing film because it's like, here's a portrait, you decide. It doesn't have an agenda so much like, oh, he's a great artist or he's a sick puppy. It's just like, here's a sort of, it's hard to make a film. It's like Battle of Algiers. That film is a fake documentary. It's the most powerful political fiction film ever made, but it's not fiction. And George Bush's cronies used it as a training film, and the Black Panthers use it as a training film. So there's something in between there that you can do. So you handled that question well. And I want to get into morals and ethics, the difference in part two, but it's also William Blake. We
hmm
become what we behold.
hmm
So, that's the thing. Why don't we close out? And I
sure.
really appreciate
Yeah,
this.
I really love this
Yeah, this
conversation, Jerry.
part
Thank you
one.
so
And
much for the
yeah,
questions.
no, Jonathan, we can really get deeper into a lot of what you pursued in your career because it's so many things. And it's great that you're still teaching, it's called media literacy, basically. It's how to think about thinking. And I appreciate that. But this is Shelby Foote. And you haven't brought up the word truth a lot, but this is a quote I would love for you to just respond to in any way. A fact is not a truth until you love it.
Okay. Well, I'm not familiar with the quote. Um, I'm not sure how I would respond to that because there are a lot of things going on with that quote. I would take I would start to dissect this term love. A fact is not
First,
the
that's
truth.
the first word you would go for. Yeah.
Because does love does love just mean that you're attracted to it? It's um, uh, if I can just sort of call up the ghost of Sigmund Freud here, are we using the word love really as a substitute for lust?
Yeah.
Imagine saying truth is, or what a fact is what is that? A fact is
A
not the
fact,
truth, right? So a
a
fact is
fact
not the
is
truth
not
until you lust after it.
until you
So if you
lust after it. Yeah.
so I would say perhaps in today's media environment that would be the case. That is, facts are only facts, and facts are only considered true unless you lust for them as facts. So and uh, um, you
That's
know
really good. See, that's what Marshall taught us. That you don't just settle for an aphorism. You get your whatever kind of epiphany or truth or whatever you get from an aphorism's good, but how do you take it farther? How do you reword it? He took Robert Browning's "our reach should exceed our grasp," or "what is heaven for?" And he changed it to "our reach should exceed our grasp," or "what is a metaphor?"
right, yeah.
Which is amazing. So you changing that word, no one's done that. I've asked people,
Well,
most people don't like that quote. They don't think it's,
because but the thing about love, this term love, it can mean any number of things, but within a Freudian framework,
yeah,
love is often uh, a subterfuge word. It's a
yeah,
word. It's about lust rather than about
yeah.
true emotional commitment. So
True
I think,
emotional commitment. That is so good because most people hang on to the words fact and truth. Because, Eric taught us this great one, that the root word for uh fact and the root word for fake both are from Latin to make.
To make, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like, well, in fact, because people go, I hate fake things. I want factual things. Yeah, well, they're both making shit up,
Right.
homie. So here's actually the bonus last question,
Okay.
Jonathan, is, and we can go into that whole truth thing because I have a whole slew of quotes
Right.
on truth that are just jumping off or
Okay.
points or prompts to
So you've
study.
given me food for thought for our next
Yeah,
conversation.
but this is, if Marshall said that all words are metaphoric, then what's the difference between metaphor and literal? Because isn't literal just a metaphor? So, what's the difference between literal and metaphor if all words are metaphorical?
Well, Derrida said the same thing. Derrida said that all language is metaphor. Um, and I'll go back to something I said earlier, which had to do with you asked me the question about what's faster, thinking or the speed of light.
Yeah.
And my response had to do with the fact that we tend to muddy our thought and censor and edit our thought. So there's I don't think that we can claim that there's anything that we can call pure thought. That thought is always going through this transformational process, and part of that process, of course, as we start to language our thought, express our thoughts linguistically, is this idea of metaphor, where and I think metaphor is also a way of it's a defensive mechanism that we use, like mythology. If we expand metaphor writ large, of course, is mythology, and Roland Barthes wrote quite extensively on this notion of mythologies of ways of glossing over those things which are not necessarily totally explicable, or may in fact be unpalatable towards us. So metaphors are a way of polishing our thinking,
Yeah.
as mythology is, and I think that they're in a way they act similarly. Both are analogous ways of thinking and speaking. Literalness, again, if literalness is the equivalent of what we would call pure thinking, I don't know. I mean, certainly it's up to the listener or the reader to make up their mind about what might be a literal utterance.
That's the user is the content. That's why Marshall mid-career changed the medium is the message or the medium is massage to the user is the content.
Yeah. Like I'm just thinking, it just popped into my mind right now. Take, for example, the tremendous adherence to conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And I sit and I think, and I talk with friends and colleagues. How could you believe such crap? And how, in other words, how can you take things so literally? How can you understand something which is quite false as a literal truth? And I sort of pose that question rhetorically. I'm not going to go take several hours now to answer that, but I think literalness is in the mind of the beholder. I don't necessarily think that we can imply that an utterance is literal, especially if we flip cause and effect.
Yeah. It's pretty heavy, Jonathan. It reminds me of, I'll just close out with this aphorism, and you can respond to it next part. Part two is Louis Buñuel said, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. So, and he's being satirical and ironic, but in a way, there's a lot to that. There's a
Yeah.
depth to that,
Right.
because you know how to analyze words. Well, what do you mean by seek the truth? One guy
Right.
goes, that's bullshit, because if I'm seeking something, it's because I want to find it,
Right. Right.
So,
All right, now,
John,
I'll put that under my thinking cap for next time.
well, we'll hook up maybe 2, 3, 4 months down the line for
Sure,
part.
let me know. I'm happy to
Jonathan,
chat. This has been a lot of fun.
I really appreciate it. I really learned.
I've been doing so much thinking the last hour and a half, I'm gonna go take a nap.
Like I've had too much to think, but I really appreciate your time and energy. I learned a lot.
My pleasure. My pleasure,
Even
Gerry.
though
Thank you
I'm
for the
gonna
invitation. Very kind of you.
even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.